We have, I think, a few interesting questions for today. And Michele, what shall we do? First, brief introductions for those people who do not know it yet and might be here for the first time. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah. You want to do that?
Yeah, maybe let's do it the first. Let's do it like last time. So make it a bit interactive. So firstly, this is, of course, a radical conversation. So Michele and I want to take a few topics apart that we both find interesting and hope you will find interesting as well, to maybe get a little bit more critical thinking into the current dialogue. But starting with ourselves. So Michele, maybe let me ask you again, like I did last week. Who are you? What brings you here? And what have you got on mind for our conversation today?
Well, so thank you, Otti, and welcome everyone. So I'm Michele Zanini. I am passionate about building organizations that are fit for people and fit for the future. I've been working with Gary Hamel for over a decade after 10 years at McKinsey. You know, what we thought we'd do is, as Otti alluded to earlier, is just share some thoughts about like interesting things that have popped up in the management world over the last week or so that we think you guys might find interesting, and maybe put our spin on those things, and then tackle a topic that maybe a little bit more in depth. This week it's the future of work, which Otti has set up with some sort of like funeral like theming in the promos. So we'll talk about that, and I'm really looking forward to getting your thoughts, which is why, as I said earlier, we're doing this on Zoom, so we'll want you to participate. You can weigh in throughout this conversation on the chat, but then we'll definitely want to open it up and just have a dialogue in the latter stages of this. This is scheduled to be to run for an hour. It probably won't go beyond that, but whatever, we'll be guided by your interest and your passion. And if after 30-40 minutes we feel like we've we solved the world's problems, we can adjourn and get an earlier start to our evening if you're in Europe, or the rest of the day if you're in the US. So anyway, that's just a quick intro. Otti, what about you? What's your deal?
Thank you very much. And I think I hear a topic, I hear a theme, which is the second time today that I'm hearing, that ex-management consultants are trying to redeem themselves a little bit by creating a better world after they have invested their efforts and hopefully in making the world not so good in the first place. So it's an interesting theme, Michele, that I'm sure we're going to encounter again. But I'm of course, just joking. And what I would invite everybody to do on the chat, if you want, maybe also introduce yourself and maybe include any thoughts on the topics that have come to your mind. So as I said, I try to frame this discussion for today a little bit as, is it dystopia? Is it utopia? And we're going to go into that in a short while. But what are your thoughts? And where am I coming from? So similar to Michele, I'm very passionate about building better businesses. I've come from 25 years of management experience in different sectors, from being an entrepreneur to going into non-profit, then into consulting, and then into large companies. And I think I'm equally to Michele now very passionate about asking the question, where are we exactly and how can we go further from here? How can we make sure that the future of work is going to be exciting and interesting? And I love the quote, Michele, on your book about humanocracy. What was it? Building organizations as awesome as the people within. I think that's a very, very good starting point, I think, for our thinking.
Awesome.
And for today, go on, Michele.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Very, very American thing.
Indeed, yeah, beautiful. And then, so I think what we're going to do today is, again, we go a little bit into what we've heard over the last week in terms of news, because again, I think what Michele and I wanted to do is have a little dialogue about management, because we have a lot of news journals and newspapers and discussions on talk shows and so on about politics, but there's actually no place where we can have a roundtable to take some of the management topics apart. And I think that's what we want to offer a little bit for people who want to go behind the news in management, so to speak. So we will look a little bit at the news headlines and then go into the topic. And Michele, I will open the floor again for, I know you have some interesting topics, and I know you wanted to show the Amazon one that we found quite intriguing in the context of the topic, but do you want to start with some tops and flops of the week?
All right, sure. Yeah, I can do that. And I'll just share my a few pages here. So the first one is this article by Andrew Hill. Some of you might have seen it already. Basically taking issue with the notion of the burning platform, that it's not a helpful term, and it's just like very negative, and it just may engender resistance and so on, which I think it's a fair point to make. And he does mention in the article Stephen Elop at Nokia, who famously in 2011 basically said, hey, Nokia is standing on a burning platform. The iPhone and other changes to the industry are threatening us, and we need to get our stuff together, right? Which is fair enough. And but to me, the point wasn't that he used the wrong term. The point is that by the time Stephen Elop made this comment wrote this memo in 2011, Nokia's platform was like way past burning, like it was smoldering. They're like embers, on the platform, because the company had, lost a significant amount of share of the market. I mean, they were, before the iPhone, Nokia had about 40% of the global smartphone market. By the time 2011 came about, it was down in the mid-20s. So they almost lost half of it by the time he's talked about the burning platform. And it's like, no, the platform, the strategy emergency you called is like long over. Like it's like 4 years too late. And I think this is in general symptomatic of how change happens in large organizations, where by the time an issue gets big enough for the CEO to kind of get a move on, it's too late. The organization is already on the back foot. So yeah. So anyway, that was my spin. Yeah, burning platform.
Maybe
yeah.
Michele, if I can build on two things. One, I think in transformation, what we have always been saying from an agile perspective is when you need the burning platform to create a big restructuring, you have already missed the adaptation with the market. So in reality, all these big transformation programs are probably evidence of the fact that you have somehow lost the plot already.
Yeah.
I think the second thing that I found interesting in that article that you just shared is the fact that a behaviorist economist, I think or a psychologist was mentioned in the article, who suggested kind of fear is good to drive short-term impact, but it's not good long-term. And I think it was interesting at the Drucker Forum or the Drucker Day over this week, John Hagel was there. John Hagel has written a new book, which is going exactly into this topic, saying that fear is not very good to create a sustainable narrative to change things. And I think that is something that we need to bear in mind. It's more difficult to construct a message based on hope, but probably it's a lot more sustainable and doesn't nurture some underlying kind of antagonisms that will ultimately come to bite you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally agree. I mean, I think change burning platform is it's a wrong way to frame it, and it's just a lagging indicator, because the announcement is like 2 years too late often, relative to what you need. And when they're and I think it has to do with the fact that organizations change in this kind of very top-down way, which congenitally makes them difficult to adapt. All right, so that's one. The other thing I wanted to mention, last week we had this, we talked about activist investors and how they could be a force for good in the case of the Exxon board campaign. There's another really interesting development that happened. I think it was late last week. I think we talked about Eric Ries and his long-term stock exchange. Eric Ries is the person behind the lean startup idea, but one of the things he's committed to now is creating a place for patient capital and for future looking long-term focused organizations to be matched. He called it the long-term stock exchange, and two fairly big former unicorns of Silicon Valley, Twilio and Asana, are cross-listing on the long-term stock exchange, and this is breathing new life into this market. And basically, to be listed on the long-term stock exchange, you need to promise to have a certain kind of approach to governance, to managing stakeholders, to CEO compensation, and other kind of commitments that really are focused on the long term. So I think this is a great development, and I wish Eric the best, and have maybe this will help and encourage other large organizations to cross list or list on the LTSE. So that was
on this one, Michele. can I fire in a question? Because I recall you and I had a conversation about ESG at some stage.
Yeah.
And I recall you doing some investigation into the qualification to actually be certified in terms of, I don't know whether it was ESG or a kind of some CSR qualification that you were looking at. And I think one thing that stood out for you was that actually looking at the questions and looking at the assessment, there was very little about truly revolutionary practices in terms of people practices. Can you just share that a little bit? How good are these ESG qualifications?
Well, so yeah, so maybe that deserves maybe another conversation, maybe episode 3 or whatever. But the short piece on that is that so ESG, it's environment, social, and governance, right? People practices are within the S. And the S has other things like human rights, working in these, supply chain responsibility and so on. So if you look at MSCI, which is one of the biggest providers of ESG ratings, I think they have about 200 ratings for each company across the ESG, maybe 50. I might be getting the numbers wrong, but it's a small, like 50 or 40 are S. Right, within those, maybe half of them are around employees, and the employee metrics are mostly around, things that are kind of baseline or things. Of course, you want to measure things like what is the level of representation of women in different across the firm, different levels. Same thing with disadvantaged groups. What is the there may be metric around the differential between CEO and other people, but it's a fairly baseline level of assessment, and so it's like a small part of the entire rating. And plus, these metrics get weighted differently for materiality. So at the S and the employee piece is has a very small rating. So in the end, you get the employee practices are not that. The ones that are getting measured are like super baseline. They're not that interesting. I mean, of course you want people to do that, companies to do that, but they're not really indicative of whether you're, harnessing the best out of the people that work in your organization. And then, even what gets measured is not very, very heavily weighted. And I'll just give another example. So one of the metrics that they use is employee involvement. I think maybe in the case of Morgan
engagement, probably.
Yeah, no, no. I don't know if they do engagement because that's all over the place. Every company does it differently, but they do assess employee involvement, and it's a binary, like 0 or 1. That's the level at which they assess this thing. And so, like, just to tell you, Nucor, which we talk about in the book, where the frontline teams are ridiculously empowered, gets a 1. Okay, that makes sense. Amazon gets a 1 too. So basically, if Amazon and Nucor have the employees there have the same level of empowerment according to MSCI, then how exactly are we measuring empowerment and involvement, right? It's like,
and how are we going to create choice for people, right? I think one question I always get asked when I speak to like MBA classes and so on, right? They ask, Otti, how can we find those good organizations where we want to work? And then clearly, as you say, right, if it's just binary, and if Southwest Airlines gets 1 and Amazon gets 1, how are people going to find out which companies do work for them if they want that meaningful workplace?
Yeah.
And I think on metrics, on the chat, I think Jeff and Morris are warming up on some of the topics. So we're going to hear from you guys, I'm sure, later.
Yeah.
Right. But I think you're absolutely right.
We should definitely do, if the crowd is willing, we should definitely do. I have a lot of passion to do an episode around metrics and disclosures.
Let's do an episode on maybe also SDGs and CSR and so on.
Yeah.
I think we parked that for one of the next ones.
I think it's we were in conversation, Gary and I, with a few people at the World Economic Forum and others that have really focused on this topic. And I think there is potential to just hold companies to account. But but the gist of it, as you say, is like we probably need to be a little bit more bold and granular about what we measure. All right. So anyway, so that's number 2, and I'll just keep going. And then I know you got stuff to do, so I'll try to move quickly. So one really cool podcast I listened to are Conversations with Tyler. Tyler Cowen is an economist at the George Mason University. He's written a lot of really interesting books. He's a kind of polymath, omnivore, and he interviews a lot of interesting people in this podcast. this interview is with David Deutsch, who's a physicist at one of the most prominent physicists in the world at Oxford. So a lot of it is around science and so on, but there's one piece of it towards the end that really caught my attention. There's a helpful transcript here so I can highlight the bit. But Cowan basically asks David Deutsch, how do we just improve the level of innovation and productivity in scientific research? And he basically says, the one thing we need to do is improve diversity. Diversity in funding sources and the criteria in how we choose projects, how do we choose people, and so on. And basically, we have a level of standardization that is, that we're worshiping standardization to the point where it's basically squashing diversity and therefore innovation. And we need to fix this, right? And it just reminded me of the, we have a whole like shtick around standardization, the excesses of standardization, which of course is important. Like, you don't want to be completely just unstandardized, but you could almost like, there's a bureaucratic tendency to standardize everything. And if you standardize everything, you're standardizing yourself into mediocrity. So it was interesting that David Deutsch, like completely different field of endeavor and so on, was making a similar point that there's almost this, and which is why, if you look at all the metrics around productivity of science and scientific discovery, it actually has been in decline. And there's almost like this bureaucratization of research in the sciences that relies, I think, on standardization and to an extreme degree, which is then impairing performance. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
And I think it links, Michele, to another topic that you and I have on our backlog, which is meritocracy. Right? And again, it came up at the Drucker Forum this week, right? Meritocracy, is it good or bad? Is it the implementation of it that doesn't work? And I recall there's this new book, which is called The Aristocracy of Talent by Adrian Wooldridge. And I think Adrian is arguing that meritocracy is probably the best of a bad bunch. And its implementation, however, is difficult. And again, the argument that standardized testing, and this is the SAT test as opposed to standardized testing in science, right? Is however the only way to do it. But I think this opens another can of worms that we want to look at in a future episode.
Right. Yeah. I agree. And again, you gotta separate the what from the how. I mean, the standardization is important, but do you need to standardize everything? And even if you do, how are the standards developed? Right. Just to give you a quick example, again, from one of the companies we looked at, like again, I'll mention Ruka one more time. They standardize certain things like safety procedures and so on, or like pricing for products, but they're very independent. So, and in how they operate, so different teams, different plants, have their own responsibility for going to market and so on in operations. But they still follow common standards, but they don't follow the common standard because there's some person at headquarters who says, this is how you guys are gonna do it. They come together and said, this is a standard we want to follow together, right? And so again, you got to separate the what from the how. All right. Anyway, so I'll stop talking because I'm taking too much air here. Last one, which might be a nice kind of. Oh no, you wanted to do the Bloomberg one, but maybe you do that, Otzi. Why don't you do that if you want? But this is one.
I don't actually have it because I thought you picked it, so I think you should at least look at it because it's such a great story.
Cool. Let me do that. Real quick, but this is an interesting one, which is around automation and the impact automation has had on jobs. These two folks, Pascal Restrepo and Daron Acemoglu, MIT economists, have done a lot of research in this area, and it's a cool, very accessible article on Planet Money. And we'll put all the links up at the end of this discussion. But so they summarized the research that they did, and one of the cool things they said. Well, interesting, well, not cool, I guess, but kind of interesting pieces of research, implications of the research, is that a lot of innovation around automation, a lot of introduction of automation has to do with social technologies. So basically, we're automating things that are taking people out of the equation, but they're not necessarily making things better in terms of productivity for the organization or the consumer. And, so the examples that they have are like, checkout kiosk at grocery store or automated customer service software, which I'm sure you guys are all big fans of, right? They're terrible. They're told, and they're not really making things better, but they reflect this almost like bias that people have, that we just need to automate things away because human beings are just a cost that we need to minimize. and they're just like so unpredictable and hard to deal with, that, you know, it's, even though we're not really improving things for the customer, let's just get rid of people, right? So it reflects this kind of mentality, which is very kind of anti-human, that I think we need to fight.
And I think there, again, I was reading Stefano Zamani last week, who was saying sometimes we've made efficiency the goal as opposed to efficiency being kind of a necessary condition to get to whatever the purpose of the organization is. And I can only say, when I tried once, because we still have the feeling Amazon is good for customer service, I tried to use their customer service bot on the app once.
Right.
I almost got a heart attack for how bad it is, right? So the moment that you're being confronted with the technology on some of these websites, you're completely stuck. And then until you get someone on the phone,
right?
And
no, it's true.
You've lost 3 hours, right?
It's true. And, you know, but I guess what these guys are saying is that they're not even that efficient. It's not any better. It's just like, we're just replacing people almost for the sake of, from this reflexive instinct that we have of just like, you know, we just get, you know, machines are better than people. But in this case, in these endeavors, at least they studied it weren't. Okay, last one is this article about the fact that delivery people at Amazon are now getting fired by the algorithm as opposed to a boss. You know, there's a way to the Amazon tracks productivity of delivery people algorithmically, and if they don't meet certain requirements, you know, they get basically fired, right? You know, they didn't hit certain metrics. There's no HR. There's no supervisor that calls them and says, hey Joe, you know, your performance is not up to scratch. We'll let you go. It's all done. It's all done through a platform, which is pretty kind of scary and depressing. I guess my spin on this is it's not so much on the fact that, you know, it's terrible to be managed by algorithms, although I think it is in many ways, but it's the fact that, you know, maybe algorithms and AI will finally, speaking of Peter Drucker, realize his prediction that he formulated back in 1988, which was, you know, information technology will end up replacing a lot of management layers and removing them, because, you know, information can flow more easily across the organization, and people are knowledge workers, they're self-directed. You don't need to be told by a supervisor what to do. And so, you know, he expected this kind of shift to happen. It didn't happen because by any kind of metric of like the managerial footprint, you know, like number of people working in managerial positions or staff functions positions such as HR, legal, and so on, those numbers have actually soared since he made the predictions. But maybe AI will do that because, you know, the algorithm will be the boss. And so maybe the people that need to be more worried about AI and automation are not so much like the frontline people who are going to be managed by the AI, but rather the managers who are, you know, going to be made obsolete. So anyway.
At this point, I think all the managers listening in on the call, you should start to get worried, which I think maybe I want to throw out the question once we go through just a few more news on the main topic, the future of work, right? Give us your personal opinion before we start to discuss it, Michele and I. Are you on the utopia side, right? So I see Frank here, right? Frank, are we teal? And I think your shirt is almost teal, right? So are we believing that the future is going to be utopian because the consciousness shift that Frederic Laloux and others are talking about is occurring? So we will all design work better in the future, utopia? Or are you dystopian, where you say AI is going to destroy work and it's all going to be bad and we're going to be miserable? So just give us maybe the one word, utopia, dystopia, and maybe if you want to add one sentence on if so, why, or what is your view, right? So give everybody your thinking whilst Michele and I get ready. And Michele, I just want to add one thing to the AI topic, which takes us a little bit kind of towards the topic of innovation. So I came across, and this was thanks to Emanuele Quintarelli and Francesco Limona, I think, setting up a very beautiful session on the ethics of technology. And they used an example, and this example was the tomato harvester that was developed in the 60s or 70s in the US. And it was a beautiful piece of technology developed by one of the universities, but it was quite expensive. It was $60,000, $70,000 or something at the time, which only the bigger kind of tomato farmers could possibly use. And the idea was, so is this technology, which looks good, is it good or is it not good? And I was surprised. So what came out was that due to this tomato harvester being 20% more efficient and saving a lot of costs and being faster and so on. It happened that it was introduced with a big success, but only the big farmers could use this harvester. So what happened over 10 years was that the size of tomato farms was doubled. The amount of people actually doing tomato farming was reduced to 20%. So there was a big consolidation in the industry. And here's the big thing for the tomato lovers like me from Italy, right? That actually this tomato harvester could only use tomatoes that had a thick skin, because otherwise it was squashing the tomatoes whilst they were harvested. And what happened was they had to introduce a new tomato species that had thicker skin, but guess what? Was a lot less tasty. So what happened over 20 years in the US, that 99% of the tomatoes on the market became the less tasty variety than the one before the harvester. So this is, I think, sometimes we are not really aware of the repercussions that these new technologies can have, which I think opens a very interesting ethical discussion. But here I want to just share, Michele has shared I think the really insightful article. I just want to share a few news pieces that still might be quite relevant. But before I do that, I want to give you just a view of the new website that we've set up. And this is really just for us. So that because Michele and I think, found LinkedIn quite complicated. So here's just a repository for all of the recordings, if you're interested in the recordings, and all of the links, because I think really the links is what is most important. At the bottom, you will also find a little feedback form. So please feel very free to use the feedback form if you want to either get the invitations for future sessions, or just give us some other thoughts that you want us to put and host on the website. So if there's some other links or interesting things or topics for future conversations, put them on there, please, so we can evolve the conversation. Now, what I found interesting is, of course, Trump. Right, so I was waiting for the hour when eventually this whole kind of tax debate would come to some sort of legal battle, and I think here's the opening salvo. So eventually, someone is looking into the taxes, which I found from the start was a horrible idea that this man wasn't giving insight into his personal dealings. Right, what a nasty symbol in terms of the virtuousness of politics, but I think of business leaders in the same way. The second thing, and a little bit related, and I'm a little bit worried here, Michele, I don't know what your view is, the lawsuits against the big tech companies are coming up, right? And it's all about market powers and whether we have too much concentration of power through the big techs. And I think you can see one of the court cases was thrown out because it was insufficiently explained. But yeah. Michele, what's your general stance on this? Are you saying we need to regulate more, or do we need to regulate less? What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a legal scholar. I understood, but I understand that the lawsuit was thrown out because it wasn't very tightly formulated in terms of like defining the market and the actual problem. But more broadly, I you know, we talk about this in the book that companies have, through mergers and regulatory arbitrage, so market power and then insulation from market pressure, they've become quite large and are able to operate profitably with a lot of bureaucracy because they're not exposed to those pressures, right? You basically get as much bureaucracy as you can afford, and by just becoming bigger and so on, you become more bureaucratic and more protected. You become more bureaucratic. So to me, you know, yeah, there's stuff you can do internally to roll back bureaucracy and lethargy and all those things, but you also need to pressurize these organizations to do that from the outside. And maybe one chart that I might, you know, one thing we might want to talk about at some other point is dynamism. The number of companies that are, you know, kind of in the top ranks of an economy, like in the US, you know, there's a lot of people talking about the fact that there's a lot of churn, a lot of companies falling out from the S&P 500 or the Fortune 100, whatever. It's actually not the case, or better said, it used to be the case, but it's no longer the case. The chances that you'll stay on that those lists have never been higher in 20 years. So, and I did the analysis. So if you look at the Fortune 100 in the US, the number of companies that are on that list in 2020 that were on the list for 10 years before, that number is like 66%. So 66 out of 100 have been on the list for 10 years or more. If you go back to 2000, so looking at companies that were on the list in 2000 and the 10 years prior, it was like 44 companies. So the number of companies that are hanging on is larger, and I think it's a bigger number, and I think it's bigger because they've found a way to insulate themselves. So I think it is a big problem.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
very interesting. And I think again, regulation. I don't know what the kind of Jeff and Morris, give us a sign on the chat. What do you think about regulation? Right? Does it work? Doesn't it work? What do we need to do? And thanks for the chats again. I'm looking at Natalia's here on Protopia, and I'm sure we're going to come to that in a second. So let me just. So one thing that I found impressive here. We are at the stock market all-time high, and I don't know when you got up in the morning when you got up this morning and looked into the mirror and just for a second thought about it's Friday, what's the general state of the world. I'm wondering whether you thought this is kind of if stock markets are a sentiment indicator of the world, then whether you had the feeling we were at the highest levels ever in kind of the story of humanity. It certainly wasn't my feeling when I looked into the mirror this morning, whether that was my mirror image glancing at me very full of still being sleepy, or whether it's the surroundings we're finding ourselves in. But there's something going on here, I think, where clearly we're creating an ever greater drift between performance of stock markets and financial instruments and the assets, as opposed to the real world. And I just thought it was interesting. And again, maybe something for us to ponder at some stage.
Can I just say real quick, on that? I find this like to be completely nuts. I mean, in the US, so there are 7 fewer million jobs in the US economy compared to the pre-pandemic. The Russell 3000, which is the largest, it's the index, the broadest index of listed companies, is up $13 trillion from February of 2020. So before the pandemic dip. So just from February when things were normal, okay, to now, it's up $13 trillion. We have 7 million fewer people working. It's complete insane. And and the thing is, the thing that is particularly vexing for me is that all this equity appreciation will go in the pockets of executives who are getting compensated on stock performance, and I think it's safe to say that a lot of this has very little to do with their specific activities and what they did, and a lot more to do with Jay Powell and the fact that the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, is like $9 trillion.
And quantitative easing.
Yeah.
Continuing to happen.
Yeah. So
But I think this is a topic that we need to disentangle at some stage. And I'm sure, I know some of the people in our audience are really well informed in terms of the numbers, real economy versus the financial economy and so on. So I wonder, let us know if that is a topic we should go in at some stage. Here I just found, I don't know if they're called Didi or Dai, the Chinese, one of the big Chinese firms coming onto the New York stock market. So very interesting, 68 billion, right, for this, the Uber of Asia. And I think I had something on the future of work, which I'm going to use to introduce the big topic now. And I think, so those were some of the news that caught our interest. And I think some of them warrant a deeper conversation. Yet at the same time, I also thought it might be interesting, and if you have interesting things, to just bring it up once in a while and remind ourselves what's going on. So let me have a quick look at the chat and see what people think, Nikita. So I'm going to prime ourselves for the conversation. Future of work, is it just a dystopia where all of the work is going to disappear, or is it actually going to be a hopeful vision of a much better work for everybody? So let's see. Standardizing into mediocrity, this was before. Where does it start? Utopian. So Katerina is utopian, Celine is utopia, Oksana is neither, Nina utopia, Jochen utopia, but we have to put effort into achieve it. Rachel, somewhere in between, we need a vision, very nice. Morris is saying somewhere in between, same as it ever was. Susan, I just read Humankind by Ludger Bregman. It became utopian again. So Humankind, we could talk about Humankind. Look at the Guardian article, which is blasting Bregman for some of the simplification he's making. So at least you're aware of what some of the scientists think about his book, which I love, but on the other hand, seems to be very simplistic. Katerina also loves the book. Wanda, neither. Jeff, AI, a support for humans. Utopian AI is a replacement for humans. Very, very good thought. There needs to be much greater emphasis on lifelong learning. and eliminating management consultants and corporate manager jobs. No chance is, I don't know who is it, Bill, I think is a WH. Frank, technology and humans are and will be important. So that's the framing. And I want to just show one more thing, which is here, this graphic by McKinsey. And I know I'm going to get Jeff running with McKinsey, but it's just to show that after the pandemic, people already envisage quite a significant shift in terms of occupation. And I think this is probably mostly a reaction to the pandemic, but of course, it's just an indication of the more seismic shifts that we are expecting, so to speak, between now and let's say 2050. But Michele, maybe can I invite you, and I'm going to make it big, can I invite you to prime the topic with everything you heard, graveyard versus a hopeful utopia? Where are you and why? And what do you think is the most important topic we need to discuss?
Oh, geez. You're putting a lot of pressure on me, Otti. Well, I think I would separate out, the employment impact from the shitification of work, because you could also have not so much of an employment impact, but work getting shitified. So are we worried about people not finding jobs, or are we worried about people who have shitty jobs? I think, to me, I tend to be kind of optimistic, but in a way, the future is in our hands, and we need to shape it the way we want according to a particular set of values. I do worry, though, back to the point we were making earlier about automation being just uncritically used to displace work, right? That we just have this uncritical sense, we just need to get people out. People are basically semi-programmable robots. And so to the extent we have robots that are, fully programmable, that's better. And we just, and so if we don't change that way of viewing people at work, and, then things are not gonna, and let me just maybe share one thing. I don't know if this is kind of addressing what your request, Otti, but I wanted to share one set of things regarding kind of skills that we need in the future and so on, which is we hear about quite a bit, right, in the discourse around the future of work. Let me just share this. This is from the World Economic Forum. They did a big report around skills. Some of you might have seen it late last year, where they're saying, well, the skills of the future are critical thinking, problem solving, self-management, working with colleagues, right? These, fair enough, right? These, of course, and if we have organizations with, roles and jobs that are in these, that reflect these skill sets, we're probably going to be safe from automation, replacing people's jobs, and also making jobs better. But here's my problem, right? And there's a lot of talk around the skills gap, like we don't have enough skilled people. And so there's a lot of focus on the supply side, like the labor market, is not giving people, or people are entering the labor market don't have the skills for the organizations to use. I would say that might be true, but what's never talked about, and I think it's as big a driver, if not more, is that on the demand side, we have organizations that don't design jobs that make any use of these kinds of skills. Like, people, are creative, or they can solve problems. And yeah, you can teach people to do that, but we're not even using whatever people, bring into the organization as a baseline. And let me just give you some evidence for this. It'll take me a while to unpack it, but I promise you, it's kind of simple. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US categorizes every single occupation according to different skill requirements. One of these skills is originality and creativity, right? And so like some person basically says, looks at every job, like flight attendant, bank teller, construction worker, and says, to what extent is creativity an important characteristic for success in this job, right? And, basically 50, it's on a scale of 0 to 100, 50 is kind of important. So above 50, it's important. Below 50, not so important. So I looked at every single, Gary and I looked at every single category of occupation in the US, and then multiplied that by the number of people working in those occupations. And what you find, so it's up, employment weighted kind of scores. So what you find is the vast majority, 70% of the, and this is pre-pandemic, right? But I think, it's still representative. 70% of the jobs in the US economy don't require people to be original, to be creative at work. Okay. So and this is, I don't think it's because only 30% of people in the workforce can be original. I don't think that's true. Originality is, can be more or less distributed. And some people are going to be super original. Some people are going to be less original. But the fact that you can be capable of original thinking and thought is more than 30%, right? I mean, people are original in the way they contribute to YouTube, in the way they plan events for their family in all sorts of ways. But at work, we've created this amazing inequality of opportunity when it comes to these skills, to exercise these skills. And so to me, this is the problem. Like, we can talk as much as we want about like the fact that these skills are important, but if we don't create jobs that reflect these skills, we're screwed. And the people that are going to be working in these jobs are screwed. And it's not about training them. It's about creating the organizational environment where they can actually exercise these skills. So anyway, that's my rant, and I'll stop.
Wonderful. And I mean, I'm sorry that we should set up these discourses so that we have almost like a debate. But in reality, I think Michele and I don't want a debate. We want a dialogue where we're looking behind the scenes and involve you all in shaping our thinking. And here, Michele, I agree with you. I love the way that you're framing demand versus supply. And then maybe let me just allow me just to unpack maybe a little bit more what you call the supply side. So I think on the supply side, so what is happening with our jobs, right? I just wanted to bring one thing into the picture. So there's a lot about this very scaremongering debate about AI. So I was with someone from the CIPD at a symposium on purposeful and meaningful work, sponsored by King's College on Tuesday. And if anyone wants the references, please just let me know. And the CIPD, now this is in the UK, but the CIPD had done a research to look at people impacted by AI over the last so many years in so many businesses. It was a large sample. Had it increased or had it decreased work? And the result was actually, on balance, the introduction of AI had created more work than less. And this guy, who was a statistician, right? And someone suggests there are only three types of lies, right? Normal lies, big lies, and statistics. But certainly this guy said that he couldn't, based on his research, make the assumption that the introduction of more AI would actually destroy jobs, which I think is very interesting. All right, so one, is it actually true that AI will destroy jobs? The second point on the supply side, I think, is we certainly see a shift. We see a shift between industries from non-knowledge job towards knowledge jobs, and I think that is where a requirement to upskill does come from. We also see a very strong shift from rural areas to urban areas. And this is where a mobility requirement comes in, also in terms of public policy debate. And what people often do not realize is the complexity at a geographical level. So where the Western world has, apart from Africa, in all geographies, the population is shrinking. So we have a workforce that grows older. And therefore, by all the statistics that we've seen by 2035 in Europe, even if we automate 22% of jobs, which is the current idea or activities, we will not have enough workers in the workplace to actually do the jobs that we are anticipating to have. Right? So the demographic shift is another angle. And it was very interesting at the Drucker there to see Aviva Cox and Linda Grattan says the same, to again look at 100-year lifespan. We need to change our mind from the typical idea that we have 3 phases in life, from kind of growing up and going to school, working life, pension. Now in the pension phase, we actually probably have another 20 years of a good life where we as elder people will do things, and then we go into that typical pension age. So that's on the supply side. And I think that is important to disentangle it a little bit. On the what you call the demand side, I think, Michele, 2 thoughts, right? One, as you described, it's about meaningful jobs. And again, the CIPD confirmed meaningful jobs are jobs where you have complexity. So there's a creativity requirement, and you have development opportunities, right? So organizations need to create meaningful jobs for people to actually make it meaningful. Otherwise, what are we talking about? But I'm almost suggesting there's a third angle, which is a moral or philosophical angle, which is, I'm always saying it's not about the future of work, which kind of positions work as the victim of the future. It's about the work of the future. What work do we want in the future? Is it the John Maynard Keynes, we only want to work 15 hours per work week? What type of work do we want? And is work really different from life, or are we actually talking about what's the future of our lives? Which is a much more intriguing story, and maybe one that is also a little bit less easily answered, right? Because I think here we really need to think about, if organizations are like mini states, like the mini Greek polis of the old days, then maybe the right approach, as a very clever youngster, Matisse, was suggesting the other day, maybe we should look at what type of people our organizations produce, in inverted commas, to make a judgment as to whether our economy is good or bad. And I'm looking at some of the statistics where up to 40% of people after the pandemic want to look for new work because the old work is not meaningful. And I'm suggesting that maybe, only maybe, the current system is not producing the type of life that we actually want to have. And then we can talk about, should we do other things and only use work as an instrumental feature of our lives? But with 60 to 70% spend of our waking hours in the office, that is probably not the best of ideas. And maybe we need to go back to a more Aristotelian standard. I wanted to bring Aristotle in at least once, where work becomes where work becomes the cultivation of character. And actually, it is about creating together a shared and sustainable prosperity for all, the good society. And economy and businesses are just a means to that end, and not a separate world where different rules work and where we all give performance reviews to our wives and sons at the end of the year. Michele, and with that, I close.
Although I do get performance reviews from my wife, and they don't, and they happen weekly. But anyway, no, but I think you're right. In a way, it's that you have to get the right future of work, you kind of have to go to the past and go to some pretty timeless human truths, right? That Aristotle, Clink, we should get paid every time we say Aristotle. Self-direction, and and if you just infuse those values of of autonomy, of dignity, and virtue in the work, then I don't think you have to worry about much. I mean, the only other, let me just share, because one other thing that I found interesting in this World Economic Forum report, self-management is a top 3 skill, right? Okay, great. This is like, people are just we're so far off from giving people the ability to self-manage in organizations today that, again, like, this is what needs to change if we want to have a better future. We need to kind of focus on individuals and think about designing jobs, so that you are expanding the perimeter of human agency, right? And I think if you do that, you don't have to worry about things. I mean, I know I mentioned Nucor too many times, but let me just allow me one more time, because I think it's a pertinent example. So they're in steel. They're the biggest automator in the industry. They use automation like crazy. And you know who suggests the automation improvements? Frontline workers. You know why they do that? Because they get paid on their productivity. So they'd be idiots if they didn't try to automate low value added tasks. And you know also why? Because they don't get fired in a downturn when there is maybe a lull in demand, right? They get, they train themselves, or they try to do other things, or they mow the lawn, and they cut back on external providers and do the work themselves, and so on. But they have this kind of implicit contract with the company that, we won't fire you when you're gone. So you should feel free to kind of implement the best possible work model, because you'll get to benefit from that in the long term. So if more companies were like that, then again, we would have nothing to fear about the future, right? And AI and automation.
Which I think, I mean, and I don't know if Natalia is still there. Otherwise, I will ask Natalia in a second to comment. I think she had to drop, maybe. I think that's what she meant by protopia. But I remember Ernest Hemingway, who once suggested that in the end, the age was handed the kind of shit that it demanded. And I guess it goes back to, what future do we want? And if you look at the chat, Natalia's point on prototyping, how do we get there? What are the small experiments that we can make to actually progressively go there? I recall Mick Wheatman talking about islands of sanity, right? So maybe we need to create some of those islands. But here, Michele, we've got 10 minutes. Shall we invite
Let's just open it up.
people for a short intervention on this, and maybe say, what's your view? What's the one thing we should do? Let me be challenging, because we all have intellectual opinions, and I look at the people on the call, wonderful thinkers. Can I challenge you to give us the one thing that you feel we should do, as opposed to talk about it? anyone has any thoughts, just jump on stage. And there's Morris. Come on, Morris. Morris, you need to unmute.
Okay,
sorry.
now I've unmuted myself. So the one question we need to ask ourselves breaks down into two parts. The first is, what is a sustainable life for everybody? And then question two, how the hell do we get there? Focus on those two things and we start to change the game. There's no simple answer. There's no straightforward thing. It's a continuous process. But as long as we lie to ourselves that our little bubble in the Western world is what it's all about, and we ignore the fact that since I started talking, another load of babies have died and billions are living in poverty and despair, we are nowhere. I also, as I wrote recently to you, Otti, don't want my grandchildren to ask me, so what was a fish? Time to get real about it all. And with that, I'll shut up.
Nice, Morris. And Michele, what's your reaction?
No, I think that's right. I mean, we need to build a sense of urgency. You know, I guess I maybe it's naive, or maybe just the product of my personal kind of professional lens and bent. But I feel like if we create, you know, teams within organizations that are very human-centric and organizations themselves that are very human-centric, then, you know, we'll create societies that are very human-centric, and it's kind of a bottom-up effort. And you know, and it, you know, that's maybe not a very direct way to solve the kind of global warming problem. Maybe there are other ways to do that that are more top-down and so on. But I just have this hope that, you know, if we're based around the importance of human beings at work, a lot of the problems are going to sort themselves out.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, right? So I think what Morris is also saying, there's no one answer. Rachel, I mean, I'm just gonna, if you don't want to come on, it's not, I think it is streamed. So if you don't want to come on, just either don't come by video or just ignore it. But I think, Rachel, you're talking about wicked problems and being curious. What's your perspective?
I can't run the video, I'm afraid. So my perspective is that we need to acknowledge there are so many problems out there where probably we can't even agree on what the root cause is, much less what the solution is going to look like. So I honestly think that when it comes to the diversity angle, the more perspectives we have, the better. I mean, from what I see, there's a lot of talk of diversity, but not inclusion, yes. And if you just go back to the stats which Michele showed us earlier, I think only 20% of employees say they're actually listened to, which shows you how far off we are from actually including different perspectives. So this is why I think we all need to be curious and be constantly asking, how can we be better? Links to the prototopia, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. It was mentioned earlier, I think.
Nice, Rachel, thank you so much.
You're
welcome. And I wonder, Skill, I saw you kind of being a bit provocative on the chat or questioning ourselves. Are we in a bubble here? Is it a luxury problem? And actually, is anyone listening? I don't know if you're still there. Do you want to contextualize what's coming up for you? I know Skill is there. Otherwise, Michelle, I've also seen you violently nodding to some of the arguments, Michelle. Is it something coming up for you that you're just, or you're whenever you want, right? So just come in whenever you're ready. Who else is there? Jeff, I'm sure, Jeff, you must have an opinion, not only on the McKinsey charts, but anything that came up for you?
Not the charts. The charts are good. They're always good at charts. The problem is that that what they do is they lom themselves onto the senior executives, keep the senior executives in the position of being the decision makers, stop people in the body of the organization from stepping up to any decision making. So you can never get sense making, decision making and action taking embedded in the organization. So the organization can't adapt and adjust in an agile way to a changing world. And because the senior executives need the consultants to keep them in place, and the consultants need the senior executives to keep hiring them, to keep their junior brains on stick consultants billable, you've got a codependent system that is currently worth $250 billion a year. So unless you break that, you're never going to get senior executives to give up the power of being the decision makers so that they can actually create the kind of culture where sense making, decision making and action taking is embedded in the organization at a deep level and distributed and iterated, etc.
So what I'm hearing is, and Michele, maybe, I don't know if anyone else wants to come in, but maybe, I know you need to jump on the hour. So maybe if you want to close it with these last provocations. So on the one hand, Natalia is saying prototopia, little steps, making it always a little bit better. And I think Rachel was going there as well. But I think Jeff is saying here, unless we change the system and the context, it's going to be very difficult to actually have sustainable change. And maybe closing with that, so we discussed future of work, and we are, I think, all saying there is a chance to make it right. And it's not the problem of the future of work. It's even today the problem of how we look at work and what we make of it. So Michele, after all of this, what's your final view and how do we close this call?
Well, I think we gotta, I think these are all very, very good points. I don't know if I can add much more other than to say perhaps that, you need to operate at both levels, right? You need to seek some of those systemic levers, whether, it's around legislation or measurement and disclosures or education and so on. So I think it's important to certainly operate there. But at the same time, I think large scale change that stakes is always the change that, to me, starts at the periphery and then finds a way to snowball, right? So even large, like the end of feudalism and whatever, like there was no like big meeting where they said, okay, let's get rid of feudalism, right? It just kind of, it evolved over time and people found a new way of governance and creating roles in society that was deeply different. And it was by, changing one feudal town at a time in a way, right? And so like, what can we do to create that local change that then hopefully snowballs? But not forgetting though that, unlike the time of the feudal system, we do have technology, we have ways to collaborate at large scale globally. And so maybe there are things we can do there too. But I still think in that way, I'm a conservative, even though I try to be a bit of a revolutionary, that, change needs to kind of be, increment. Authentic change starts from the bottom up, and it's when people start rising and doing things, activating themselves locally that you can have it stick.
I would agree with that. And I think Rachel and Nina and so on, I think most people are saying we can actually do it. It's not the hierarchy, it's probably the hierarchy in our minds. And I would say we are what we think. And by starting to engage in a conversation that creates a different dialogue, I'm pretty certain that our actions and behaviors will start to change. And maybe then indeed it is valuable, even if we might be a bit in a luxury bubble as someone suggested, that we come together and hold these questions together. And I want to wholeheartedly thank you all for being, again, on a Friday afternoon here with us, holding those questions. And maybe over the weekend, let's ponder whether we can do something next week that's going to make a real change to the people around us, at least. So with that, thank you for being radical. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you that we all together have created something new. Look at the website if you have any other ideas or suggestions for future topic. And I would say, Michele, on behalf of both you and I, have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, and give us your feedback. I know this time we spent more time on the news commenting and so on. That was kind of half of the session. Tell us if you like that, or if we went on and on. Just give us your unvarnished feedback. We'd love to make this interesting to you. So please let us know. And thanks for hanging in with us. Stay tuned. Thank you. Take care.